The Story King, where every tale finds its throne. She was warned not to speak to the king, he spoke to her first. The guards found her 3 minutes after midnight, kneeling in the forbidden garden with dirt beneath her fingernails and secrets in her eyes. Alara's breath caught as torchlight flooded the darkness, illuminating the white roses she'd been tending, the queen's roses, the ones no servant was permitted to touch. But the queen had been dead for exactly 1 year tonight, and someone needed to remember her with more than stone monuments and hollow prayers. On your feet, the captain's voice cut through the night air like a blade. She rose slowly, her simple grey dress stained with earth and dew. Around her, the garden seemed to hold its breath, 12 guards forming a circle, their crimson cloaks marking them as the king's personal regiment. This was worse than she'd imagined. The king will see you now, the captain said, and Alara's blood turned to ice. She'd been at the palace for 3 months, carefully invisible among the 100 other servants who scrubbed floors and changed linens. She'd heard the warnings whispered in the scullery, repeated like prayers at bedtime, never look directly at him. Never speak unless spoken to. And above all, never, ever seek his attention. King Aldrich was known by many names in the hushed conversations of the servant quarters: the Winter King, the Silent Storm, the widower who forgot to grieve. Since his wife's death, he'd become something darker than before, something that made even his advisors walk on glass. 3 servants had been banished in the last month alone, though no one would say what their crimes had been. Only that they'd somehow displeased him. And now Alara was being marched through the moonlit corridors to face him. The throne room doors were black oak, 30 feet tall, carved with scenes of ancient battles. They opened soundlessly, revealing a vast chamber lit by 1,000 candles. Their flames reflected off walls of polished obsidian, making the entire room shimmer like the inside of a dark jewel. At the far end, on a throne of twisted silver, sat the king. Alara's first thought was that he looked nothing like she'd expected. She'd imagined someone ancient, weathered by grief and power. But King Aldrich couldn't have been more than 30, with sharp features that might have been handsome if not for the absolute coldness in his dark eyes. His black hair fell to his shoulders, and he wore no crown, just the weight of command that seemed to pull at the very air around him. "Leave us," he said, his voice low and precise. The guards hesitated. The captain cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, protocol requires." "Leave us." They retreated like shadows fleeing dawn, and the doors closed with a sound like a crypt ceiling. Alara stood alone before the king, her heart hammering against her ribs. She kept her eyes on the floor, on her dirt-stained hands clasped before her. Silence stretched between them, thin and terrible. "Look at me," he commanded. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, but disobedience would mean exile, or worse. Slowly, Alara raised her eyes to meet his. The impact of his gaze was physical, like being struck by winter wind. His eyes were the color of a storm over the ocean, gray and turbulent and entirely unreadable. For a long moment, he simply studied her, his expression revealing nothing. "You were in the Queen's garden," he said finally. Not a question. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Why?" Alara swallowed hard. The truth felt dangerous, but lies would be worse. To tend her roses. Someone should remember her with living things, not just stone. Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or anger. She couldn't tell. "You knew the garden is forbidden." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Then you chose to break that law deliberately." He leaned forward slightly, his fingers gripping the arms of his throne. "Tell me why I shouldn't have you thrown from the palace tonight." This was it, the moment that would define everything. Alara thought of her mother in the village, depending on the coins she sent home. She thought of her younger sister who dreamed of studying medicine, who needed those coins to make that dream real. She thought of all the sensible, safe things she could say. Instead, she told the truth. "Because grief isn't meant to be locked away, Your Majesty. Not even for a king." The silence that followed was absolute. Alara watched a muscle jump in his jaw, saw his knuckles turn white against the silver throne. She'd gone too far. What is your name? The question startled her more than rage would have. Alara, Your Majesty. Alara Thorn. How long have you been here, Alara Thorn? 3 months, Your Majesty. And in those 3 months, what have you observed about your king? The question was a trap. It had to be. But his eyes held something that looked almost like curiosity, and Alara found herself answering honestly. That you don't sleep well. The candles in your chambers burn until dawn. That you walk the eastern ramparts when you think no one is watching. That you haven't entered the Queen's garden since the day she died, even though it was her favorite place in the world. She paused, then added quietly, that you're drowning, and everyone is too afraid to offer you a hand. King Aldrich stood abruptly, and Alara stepped back on instinct. He was tall, she realized, taller than she'd thought. He descended the throne platform with movements that were almost predatory in the grace, stopping a few feet away from her. Do you know what happened to the last servant who spoke to me unbidden? Banished, Your Majesty. Do you know why? No, Your Majesty. She told me I looked tired. His voice was soft, almost conversational. Implied that I wasn't fulfilling my duties adequately. So I sent her away. He took another step closer. And yet here you stand, having just told me I'm drowning, and you don't seem particularly concerned about the consequences. Alara lifted her chin slightly. Would you prefer I lie, Your Majesty? For the first time since she'd entered the throne room, King Aldrich smiled. It was a small thing, barely a curve at the corner of his mouth, but it transformed his entire face for just a moment. No, he said quietly, I wouldn't. He turned away from her, walking to one of the tall windows that overlooked the palace grounds. From this height, the Queen's garden would be visible, a pale square of white roses glowing in the moonlight. I sealed that garden the day after the funeral, he said, his back still to her. I told myself it was out of respect, that it should remain unchanged, a monument to her memory. He paused. But you're right, it was grief. Cowardice dressed up as honor. Your Majesty, I didn't mean. You meant exactly what you said. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise. He turned back to face her, and something in his expression had shifted. Some wall had cracked, letting through a hint of the man beneath the crown. Tell me about the roses. What did you do to them? Just tended them, Your Majesty. Pruned the dead blooms, cleared the weeds, enriched the soil. They'd been neglected. Show me, Your Majesty. Show me what you did. Now. Before she could respond, he was striding toward the doors, throwing them open to the startled guards beyond. Bring lanterns, he commanded. We're going to the garden. The walk through the palace felt surreal. King Aldrich moved with purpose, his dark cloak billowing behind him, while Alara followed with guards bearing lanterns. Servants pressed themselves against walls as they passed, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. When they reached the garden gates, the king stopped. His hand rested on the iron bars, and Alara saw his fingers tremble, just for a moment. Your Majesty, she said softly. We don't have to open it, he told the guards. The gate swung inward with a rusty groan of hinges. The king stepped through, and Alara followed him into the garden that had been locked away from the world. The white roses glowed in the lantern light, their petals perfect and pale. Alara had worked for hours tonight, and it showed. The garden looked like something from a dream, beautiful and haunting and alive. King Aldrich walked among the roses slowly, his fingers occasionally brushing their petals. He stopped at the fountain in the center, where a stone bench sat beneath a trellis heavy with blooms. She used to sit here, he said quietly, every morning, before the sun rose. She said it helped her think. He looked at Alara. Did you know that? The head gardener told me, Your Majesty. Before he passed last year. The king nodded slowly, then, to Alara's shock, he sat down on the bench. For a long moment, he simply breathed in the scent of roses, his eyes closed. I haven't been able to come here, he said finally. Every time I tried, I felt like I was suffocating, like the walls were closing in. He opened his eyes, looking up at her. But tonight, standing here, it's different. The garden remembers her, Alara said softly. But it needs to be more than a tomb. Living things need care, or they die. Even roses, even kings. He stood then, moving closer to her. In the lamplight, his features seemed softer, more human. You were warned not to speak to me, weren't you? Yes, Your Majesty. By whom? Everyone, Your Majesty. Another small smile. And yet when I spoke to you first, you didn't simply bow and scrape. You challenged me. Why? Alara met his eyes. Because you asked me a real question. So I gave you a real answer. Do you know what I think, Alara Thorne? He was close now, close enough that she could see the silver threads in his dark eyes, the faint scar along his jawline. I think you're either very brave or very foolish. Perhaps both, Your Majesty. Perhaps. He studied her for another long moment. I'm going to ask you something now, and I want the truth. Do you fear me? Alara considered the question carefully. I fear what you could do, Your Majesty. But I don't fear who you are. Something shifted in his expression. Something that looked almost like relief. The roses, he said abruptly. Can they be saved? All of them. With proper care, yes, Your Majesty. Then you'll provide it, every night, if you wish. The garden is no longer forbidden. He paused. To you, at least. Your Majesty, I'm just a servant, I can't. You can, and you will. Consider it a royal command. He turned to leave, then stopped. Alara, yes, Your Majesty, thank you, for remembering her. For, he seemed to struggle with the words. For seeing past the crown. Before she could respond, he was walking away, his guards falling in behind him. At the garden gate, he paused one final time. I'll be walking the eastern ramparts tomorrow night at midnight, he called back to her. If you happen to be in the garden, we might speak again. If you wish. Then he was gone, leaving Alara standing among the white roses with her heart racing and the night suddenly feeling full of impossible possibility. She touched one of the rose blooms, feeling its cool petals beneath her fingers. The Queen's garden was open again. The king had smiled. And tomorrow night, beneath the stars, perhaps a drowning king and a brave servant girl would find a way to breathe again. Some warnings, Alara thought, were meant to be broken. Especially when the alternative was watching someone you could save slip beneath the surface alone. The story King, where every ending is just a new beginning.